sister's wedding planner called to say I'd been removed from the guest list per family request. I didn't call my sister. I didn't call my parents. I just sat in my car for 40 minutes. 3 weeks later, Dad showed up at my door in tears. My name's Adam. I'm 34, and I want to tell you about the worst phone call I've ever received. And I once got a call from a guy at the IRS telling me I owed $11,000 because of a clerical error from 2019, so the bar was already pretty high. I need to give you some background first, because this story doesn't make sense without it. I grew up in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, the kind of place where everybody knows your business before you do. My parents are Hank and Lorraine, married 41 years, churchgoers, the whole package. My dad's a retired electrician, and my mom worked the front desk at a dentist's office for about 2 decades. Good people by most measurements. The kind of people who bring casseroles when someone's sick and always wave at the mailman. I have one sibling, my sister, Jolene. She's 29, 5 years younger than me, and I love her. I want to say that up front because what I'm about to tell you might make it sound like I don't, but I do. I've loved her since the day my parents brought her home from the hospital, and I tried to feed her a Lego because I thought she looked hungry. We were close growing up. Not best friends close, but solid. She'd come to me when she had boy problems. I'd go to her when I needed someone to tell me I was being an idiot. It worked. But here's the thing about my family that took me way too long to understand. There was always a current running underneath everything. This subtle, unspoken hierarchy, and Jolene was at the top of it. Not in a cruel way, not in a Cinderella way. More like a gravitational pull. Everything just kind of orbited around her. When she was in high school, family dinners revolved around her cheer schedule. When she got into UT Knoxville, you'd have thought she cured a disease. When I graduated from trade school 2 years earlier with a certification in HVAC, my dad said, "Good, now you can fix the unit in the basement." I'm not making that up. That was his entire reaction. I didn't resent it, at least not consciously. I told myself it was just how families work. The youngest gets the spotlight. The oldest gets the independence. I had my own life. I'd moved to Nashville by 23, started working for a mid-size HVAC company, eventually worked my way up to lead installer, then service manager. I bought a little house in Antioch when I was 28. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. I met my wife, Sutton, at a barbecue my buddy Wes threw. She was a dental hygienist with a laugh that could fill a stadium and a zero-tolerance policy for nonsense. We got married when I was 31. Small ceremony, 60 people, backyard of her parents' place in Franklin. It was perfect. My family came to the wedding. They were polite. They smiled in the photos. But my mom spent half the reception telling people about Jolene's new boyfriend, Coulter, who was apparently some kind of rising star at a commercial real estate firm. And my dad gave a toast that was roughly 40% about me and 60% about how proud he was of both his kids. At my wedding, Sutton noticed. She didn't say anything that night, but a few weeks later she said, real gentle, "Do your parents always talk about Jolene that much?" And I didn't have a good answer. Fast forward a couple of years. Jolene and Coulter got engaged. Big ring, big announcement, big everything. My mom called me to tell me, and she was literally crying with happiness. She talked for 25 minutes straight about the proposal, how Coulter had rented out a rooftop in downtown Knoxville and hired a violinist, how Jolene just knew when she saw the candles, how the ring was custom designed and featured some kind of vintage cut that I'm sure cost more than my first car. I said all the right things. Congratulations, I'm so happy for her. Coulter seems like a great guy. And I meant it mostly. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting a little that 2 months later, when I called my mom to tell her Sutton and I were expecting our first kid. She said, "Oh, that's wonderful," in the same tone you'd use if someone told you they found a good deal on paper towels. She asked one follow-up question, when the due date was, and then pivoted right back to wedding talk because apparently Jolene was having a crisis about centerpiece heights. My future child had been acknowledged and filed away in under 90 seconds. Our son, Emmett, was born 7 months before the wedding. He was the best thing that ever happened to me. Still is. Chunky little guy with Sutton's eyes and my stubbornness. I thought maybe having a grandchild would shift things, give my parents a reason to be more present in my life. And to their credit, they visited a couple times. But the visits were short, and the conversations always drifted back to wedding planning. Jolene's wedding had become a full-time occupation for my mother. She was involved in every decision. The venue, the flowers, the napkin colors. I didn't even know napkins came in colors, but apparently choosing between champagne ivory and warm ecru was a matter of life and death. I was asked to be in the wedding party early on. Jolene called me herself, which I appreciated. She wanted me as a groomsman on Coulter's side, which was a little weird since I barely knew the guy, but I said sure. I rented the suit they picked out, which cost me $400 by the way, and I started planning to take the weekend off work. Sutton and I even booked a little Airbnb near the venue, so we wouldn't have to drive back late with Emmett. Everything was fine. Normal. Or at least what passed for normal in my family. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, I got a phone call from a woman named Waverly. She introduced herself as the wedding coordinator and said she was reaching out to confirm some recent changes to the guest arrangement. I figured it was a seating thing. Maybe they moved me to a different table. She said, and I'll never forget the phrasing, "I'm calling to let you know that per a family request, you and your plus one have been removed from the guest list. We wanted to make sure you were aware, so there's no confusion on the day of the event." I didn't say anything for about 10 seconds. Waverly, to her credit, waited. Then I said, "I'm sorry, removed?" "Yes, sir. The request came from the family. I'm not privy to the specifics, but I was asked to notify you directly." I thanked her, because apparently even when someone tells you your family just kicked you out of your own sister's wedding, you still say thank you. Tennessee manners run deep, I guess. I hung up, put my phone on the passenger seat of my truck, and I sat there. I was parked outside a supply warehouse in Murfreesboro. I just finished a job, and I sat in that truck for 40 minutes without moving. Didn't call Jolene, didn't call my parents, didn't call Sutton. I just sat there and stared at the steering wheel and tried to figure out what I'd done wrong. And here's the thing that messed me up the most. I couldn't think of anything. Not one fight, not one argument, not one harsh word. I'd been nothing but supportive, nothing but present, nothing but the good brother who showed up and didn't complain. And somehow, that still wasn't enough. I finally drove home that evening. Sutton was in the kitchen feeding Emmett, and she took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" I told her. She put the spoon down, wiped her hands on a towel, and said, "You're joking." I wasn't joking. She sat down across from me at the table, and neither of us said anything for a minute. Then she said, very quietly, "Are you going to call them?" And I said, "No. I know that sounds cold. I know some of you are thinking I should have picked up the phone immediately and demanded an explanation. But I want you to understand something. My whole life, I'd been the one who reached out. I was the one who called first, who drove the 2 hours to Knoxville for holidays, who texted happy birthday, even when mine got forgotten. I was always the one making the effort, and I was tired. If my family wanted me gone from the biggest event of the year, then they could at least have the decency to tell me why. I wasn't going to chase them for that. 2 days passed. Nothing. No call from Jolene, no text from my mom, no voicemail from my dad. Silence. Like I'd already stopped existing. Sutton was furious, the kind of quiet fury that's worse than yelling, because you know it means she's already made up her mind about someone. She didn't push me to do anything, but I could see her jaw tighten every time she looked at her phone, and there was still nothing from my family. On day 3, I broke my own rule. I didn't call, but I texted Jolene. I kept it simple. I said, "Hey, I got a call from your wedding planner saying I was removed from the guest list. Just wanted to check in and see what's going on." Casual. No accusations. I was giving her an easy out, a chance to say it was a mistake or a miscommunication. Something. She didn't respond for 6 hours. When she finally did, the message said, "Hey Adam, yeah, we had to make some adjustments to the guest list. Space is tight and Coulter's family is bigger than we expected. I hope you understand. It's nothing personal. It's nothing personal. My own sister removed me from her wedding and told me it's nothing personal." I read that message probably 30 times. Sutton read it once and said, "That's a lie and she knows it." Because here's the detail that really twists the knife. The venue they'd booked was a converted barn on a property outside Maryville, and it seated 250 people. I knew this because my mother had told me approximately 900 times. They weren't short on space. They were short on wanting me there. I didn't respond to Jolene's text. I sat there with my phone in my hand, typing and deleting about 6 different messages. One was angry. One was hurt. One was so polite it made me sick. I couldn't figure out what to say that wouldn't either start a war or make me look desperate. So I just let it sit. And then a week later, I found out the real reason. My cousin, Landry, is one of those people who knows everything about everyone. He's a bartender in Knoxville, and he hears things. He called me on a Thursday night and said, "Dude, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." He told me he'd been at a family gathering the previous weekend, one I obviously wasn't invited to, and he'd overheard my mom talking to my aunt. According to Landry, the reason I was cut from the wedding was Coulter's mother, a woman named Gemma, who I'd met exactly twice. Gemma had apparently expressed concerns about the optics of the wedding party and guest list. Specifically, she didn't want anyone there who might bring down the tone of the event. Let me translate that for you. Coulter's family was wealthy, country club wealthy. His dad was a retired orthopedic surgeon. His mom chaired fundraising galas. His sister had gone to Vanderbilt and was now married to some investment banker in Charlotte. They vacationed in Hilton Head and had opinions about wine that they shared whether you asked or not. And I was an HVAC guy. I drove a truck with my company logo on the side. I wore work boots more days than dress shoes. My hands had calluses from actual labor, and the nicest restaurant I'd been to in the past year was a steakhouse in Green Hills where Sutton and I went for our anniversary. In Gemma's world, that made me a liability, a blemish on the aesthetic. Apparently, she'd told Jolene and my parents that having a blue-collar brother in the wedding party didn't fit the image she envisioned for the photos and the event, and my sister and my parents just went along with it. Didn't argue, didn't push back, didn't say, "That's our son, and he's going to be there." They just folded. I want you to sit with that for a second. My mother and father, the people who raised me, who watched me build a career from nothing, who sat in my house and ate the food I paid for with money I earned with my hands. Those people agreed to erase me from their daughter's wedding because some rich woman thought I wasn't classy enough. Landry told me my mom's exact words were, "It's just easier this way. Adam will understand. Adam will understand." Like I was some kind of emotional vending machine that just absorbs whatever you throw at it and keeps working. I didn't sleep that night. Sutton held me in bed, and I stared at the ceiling until about 3 in the morning. I wasn't sad. I was past sad. I was in that place where the hurt loops back around and becomes something sharp and clear. I started thinking about every holiday where I'd been an afterthought, every graduation that got a shrug, every phone call that lasted 5 minutes because they had to go. Jolene was calling on the other line. Every time I'd driven 2 hours with a casserole dish in my lap and a smile on my face just to feel like a guest in my own family. The next morning, I got up, made coffee, kissed Emmett on the head, and told Sutton I was done. Not done with my life, not done with being a good person, but done performing for people who didn't value me. She nodded and said, "It's about time." I want to be clear, I didn't blow up. I didn't send an angry group text. I didn't post anything online. I just stopped. I stopped calling. I stopped texting. I stopped checking in. I removed myself the same way they'd removed me, quietly, without explanation, and without looking back. And you know what the craziest part was? It took them 3 weeks to notice. 3 entire weeks. My own parents didn't realize I'd gone silent for 21 days. That told me everything I needed to know. Meanwhile, I returned the $400 rental suit. I canceled the Airbnb. I got my money back on both, thankfully, and I threw myself into work. My boss, a guy named Sullivan, had been talking about expanding the business into commercial contracts, and I told him I wanted to lead the effort. He looked at me like I'd just volunteered to defuse a bomb, but he said yes. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and I had no intention of thinking about it. But my family, as it turned out, had other plans. Because right around the time I stopped being available, they suddenly needed something from me. And what they needed was going to blow the whole thing wide open. The first couple weeks after I went silent were rough, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. There's a difference between choosing to walk away and being okay with it. I'd chosen, but I wasn't okay. I'd go through my day fine. Work was busy. Emmett was growing like a weed. Sutton and I were solid. But then I'd be driving home at night, and some song would come on the radio that reminded me of my dad's old truck, and it would just hit me like a wall. This deep, heavy ache in my chest that felt like grief, except nobody had died. They'd just decided I wasn't worth the inconvenience. Sutton was a rock through all of it. She never pushed me to talk about it when I didn't want to, and she never minimized it when I did. One night, I was sitting on the back porch after Emmett was asleep, just staring at the yard, and she came out with 2 beers and sat next to me without saying a word. After about 10 minutes, she said, "You know, Emmett's never going to wonder if he's good enough for us. That's the difference you're already making. I had to go inside for a minute after that. Got something in my eye. Both eyes, actually. Work became my lifeline. The commercial expansion I'd volunteered for turned out to be a beast of a project, but the good kind. Sullivan gave me real ownership over it. I was meeting with building managers, drafting proposals, negotiating service contracts. Things I'd never done before. I stayed late, came in early, and for the first time in my career, I felt like I wasn't just doing a job, but building something. Within 6 weeks, I'd landed our first 2 commercial accounts, a mid-rise office complex in Brentwood and a chain of medical clinics across Davidson County. Sullivan was thrilled. He started talking about making me a partner. Let me say that again because I still can't believe it sometimes. A partner. The HVAC guy who wasn't polished enough for his sister's wedding was being offered a stake in a growing business. I didn't tell my family about any of it. They wouldn't have cared, and honestly, I didn't want to share it with them. This was mine. Around this time, something else happened that I wasn't expecting. People started reaching out to me. Not my parents or Jolene, but other family. Landry, obviously, who'd become my main line of intel. But also my Uncle Boyd, my dad's younger brother, who called me out of the blue one evening and said, "I heard what happened, and I want you to know I think it's garbage." Boyd had always been the black sheep of the family, a carpenter who lived outside Gatlinburg and didn't suffer fools. He told me he'd already told my dad exactly what he thought of the situation, and it hadn't gone over well. He said my dad got defensive and said it was Jolene's wedding and Jolene's decision, which was a convenient way to avoid taking responsibility. Boyd also told me something that planted a seed I didn't fully appreciate until later. He said, "Your dad's been stressed about the wedding costs. He and your mom put up a big chunk of the money, and Coulter's family has been adding things and expecting your folks to split it. I think your dad's in deeper than he wants to admit." I filed that away and didn't think much about it at the time. Sutton and I also started making new friends. Our neighbor, a guy named Deacon, had just moved in down the street with his wife, Rosalind, and their daughter, Harper. Deacon was a firefighter and possibly the most genuine human being I've ever met. The kind of guy who helps you carry groceries without being asked and then refuses to let you thank him. He brought over a 6-pack the weekend they moved in and said, "I don't know anybody here yet, so you're stuck with me." Within a month, we were like old friends. We started doing weekend cookouts, alternating houses, and it was so refreshingly normal. No drama, no rankings, no keeping score. Just good people being good to each other. Rosalind and Sutton hit it off too, and pretty soon we were doing double date nights and taking the kids to the park together on Saturday mornings. It's funny how when you stop pouring your energy into people who don't value you, you suddenly have room for people who do. Emmett turned 1 right in the middle of all this. We threw him a little birthday party in the backyard. Deacon and Rosalind came. Wes came with his girlfriend. A few of Sutton's co-workers showed up. We had a dinosaur cake because Emmett was obsessed with this one stuffed T-Rex he carried everywhere. It was a beautiful day, and not one member of my family was there. Not because I didn't invite them. I did actually. Sutton convinced me to send a text to my parents with the date and time, just to see. My mom responded with, "We'll try to make it, but that's the weekend of Jolene's final dress fitting." They didn't come. They chose a dress fitting over their grandson's first birthday. That was the moment something shifted permanently inside me. The ache I'd been carrying since the phone call from Waverly didn't disappear, but it cooled. It became something solid and manageable, like a stone I could put in my pocket and carry without it pulling me under. I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolved. By the time the wedding was a week away, I was in the best shape of my life, professionally and emotionally. Sullivan had drawn up the partnership paperwork. I was going to be co-owner of a company projected to clear $2 million in revenue the following year. Sutton and I had started looking at bigger houses because we were talking about having another kid. Emmett was saying dada and oh and trying to eat crayons, which I'm told is developmentally appropriate and not a sign that I'm failing as a parent. I wasn't thinking about the wedding at all. I genuinely moved past it. Or I thought I had. Then Landry called again. And what he told me made every piece of the puzzle snap into place in a way I never saw coming. He said Coulter's family had been making increasingly unreasonable demands about the wedding. They wanted a specific caterer that cost triple the original budget. They wanted a live band instead of a DJ. They wanted to fly in flowers from somewhere ridiculous. And my parents, who were splitting costs, were drowning. My dad had taken out a home equity line of credit to cover his share. My mom had cashed out part of her retirement. They were in deep, and Gemma, the woman who'd had me erased from the guest list because I wore work boots, was treating my parents' money like a suggestion box at a country club. Landry paused and said, "It gets worse." Coulter's dad, the retired surgeon, had apparently pulled aside my father at a dinner and told him, casually, almost as an afterthought, that he expected the rehearsal dinner to be covered by the bride's side as well, which in their world apparently meant my parents. We're talking another $15,000 to $20,000 on top of what they'd already spent. My dad, according to Landry, just nodded and said he'd figure it out. He'd figure it out. The man who'd removed his own son from a wedding to keep peace with these people was going to figure out how to bankrupt himself for their approval. And nobody had called me. Nobody had asked for help. Nobody had even thought to include me in the conversation. I sat with that information for about 48 hours. And in those 48 hours, I made a decision that would change everything. I want to be really clear about something before I tell you what I did. I didn't make this decision out of revenge. I know this story has been building toward a payoff, and I know a lot of you are waiting for me to destroy someone. But that's not what happened. What happened was quieter than that, and honestly, more painful for everyone involved, including me. After Landry told me about my parents' financial situation, I called Sutton into the living room after Emmett was in bed and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is how I know she was taking it seriously because Sutton normally has commentary for everything. When I finished, she said, "So what do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to talk to Uncle Boyd." I called Boyd the next morning, told him what Landry had shared. Boyd was quiet for a long time, which is unusual for him because the man normally talks like he's being charged by the word and wants to get his money's worth. Finally, he said, "Your dad's too proud to ask for help and too scared to say no to these people. He's going to bury himself." I asked Boyd if he knew the full picture, how much my parents were actually in for. He said he didn't have exact numbers, but from what he'd pieced together, they were looking at somewhere north of $60,000 all in and climbing. For context, my dad's pension was modest and my mom's retirement savings had already been rated. They were putting their financial future on the line for a party. I sat with that for a day. Then I did something that surprised even me. I called a financial advisor. Not for my parents, for myself. See, with the partnership deal Sullivan had offered me, I was about to come into a different tax situation, and I'd already been planning to sit down with someone about structuring things properly. But during that meeting, I also asked a broader question. I said, if someone's parents had taken on significant debt for an event and were too proud to admit it, what would be the smart way to help without enabling more bad decisions? The advisor, a woman named Sloan who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the energy of a very patient librarian, looked at me for a second and said, "You'd want conditions. Not strings attached in a manipulative way, but real, structured conditions that protect everyone." That conversation planted the framework for what came next. I also did something else. I reached out to Jolene's maid of honor, a woman named Tully. Tully and I had actually gotten along pretty well over the years. She was Jolene's best friend from college, straightforward, no drama, and she'd always been kind to Sutton. I texted her and asked if we could talk. She called me back within an hour, and the first thing she said was, "Adam, I'm so sorry about the guest list thing. I told Jolene it was wrong." That caught me off guard. I asked Tully what she knew. She told me more than I expected. She said Jolene had been increasingly stressed and that Coulter's family had essentially taken over the wedding planning. Gemma was making decisions and presenting them as done deals, and Jolene was going along with it because she didn't want to rock the boat. Tully said Jolene had cried when she agreed to remove me. She said Jolene called it the hardest decision she'd made, which honestly made me feel both better and worse at the same time. Better because my sister apparently did feel something. Worse because she felt it and still did it. Tully also confirmed what Landry and Boyd had told me about the money. She said my parents were visibly stressed and that my mom had lost weight. Not in a healthy way. In a not sleeping, not eating, drowning in anxiety way. Tully said she'd try to talk to Jolene about it, but Jolene kept saying Coulter's family would even things out eventually. Tully's exact words were, "She's living in a fantasy, Adam. These people are using your parents like an ATM." After that call, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and I knew exactly when. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday. The rehearsal dinner was Friday night. I had no intention of attending either, but I knew that the week leading up to it was when the final bills would come due, and that was when my dad would be at his most desperate. I didn't have to seek him out. I just had to wait. In the meantime, I worked with Sloan to put together what she called a family financial intervention plan. Basically, I was prepared to help my parents cover their debts, but only under specific conditions. The money wouldn't be a gift. It would be a structured loan with a clear repayment plan they could actually handle. And the conditions weren't about money. They were about accountability. I wanted a real conversation. Not a text, not a secondhand apology through Landry. A real, face-to-face acknowledgement of what happened and why. I wasn't asking anyone to grovel. I was asking them to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. Sutton helped me draft the terms. She's better with words than I am, and she made sure the language was firm but not cruel. We printed it out. 2 pages. Clear, simple, fair. I put it in a folder on my kitchen counter and left it there. Then I waited. The wedding was in 5 days. I went to work. I came home. I played with Emmett. I grilled steaks with Deacon on Wednesday night, and we talked about absolutely nothing important, and it was perfect. Sutton and I watched a movie on Thursday night. Some comedy she picked that I couldn't focus on. My mind kept drifting to that folder on the counter. Friday morning, the day of the rehearsal dinner, my phone buzzed at 7 in the morning. It was a text from my mom. The first communication from her in almost a month. It said, "Adam, can you please call your father? He won't say it, but he needs you." I read it twice. Then I put my phone down, got dressed, and went to work. I know what you're thinking. That sounds cold. Maybe it was. But I'd spent 34 years being the one who jumped when they needed something. And for once in my life, I needed them to come to me. Not a text. Not a proxy. Them. It happened on Saturday morning, the day of the wedding. I was in my garage, changing the oil in my truck because that's what I do when I need to not think. Emmett was inside with Sutton. It was a clear, cool morning in Nashville, the kind where the air smells like cut grass and possibility. And then I heard a car pull into my driveway. I rolled out from under the truck and saw my dad's old Silverado parked behind Sutton's car. He was sitting in the driver's seat. He didn't get out right away. I stood up, wiped my hands on a rag, and waited. After about 2 minutes, the door opened. My dad stepped out, and the first thing I noticed was that he looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. His face was drawn, his shoulders were slumped, and his eyes were red. He'd been crying. Might still have been crying. He walked up to me, and he stopped about 5 feet away, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to come closer. He said, "I messed up, Adam." And that's when my hands started shaking. My dad stood in my driveway, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His flannel shirt was wrinkled, which might not sound significant, but my dad irons his flannels. The man standing in front of me looked like he'd gotten dressed in the dark and driven 2 hours on autopilot. I didn't say anything. I just stood there with the oil rag in my hand and let him talk. He said, "I should have called you the day it happened. I should have told that woman to go to hell when she said what she said about you." His voice cracked on the last part. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and kept going. "Your mother and I let it happen because we were scared. Scared of losing Jolene, scared of ruining the wedding, scared of Coulter's family thinking less of us. And the whole time, the only person who should have mattered was standing right here, and we pushed you away." I let that sit for a few seconds. Then I said, "Come inside, Dad." We sat at my kitchen table. Sutton brought coffee and then took Emmett into the back room to give us privacy, but not before she gave my dad a look that communicated about 15 things at once, none of them particularly warm. My dad noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He told me everything. How Gemma had approached him and my mom at a dinner 2 months before the wedding and explained, in that polite Southern way that's really just cruelty in a cardigan, that the wedding needed to reflect Coulter's professional image, and that having a tradesman in the wedding party might send the wrong message. My dad said he sat there and didn't push back. My mom nodded along. He said the shame of that moment had been eating him alive. He told me about the money. $63,000 total. The home equity line, my mom's retirement withdrawal, a personal loan from their bank. All to fund a wedding that someone else was designing. Coulter's family had contributed a similar amount, but Gemma kept adding costs and splitting them retroactively, so my parents were constantly catching up to bills they hadn't agreed to. My dad said he'd been too embarrassed to say anything because he didn't want to look like he couldn't provide for his daughter. I asked him one question. Did Jolene know? He paused. Then he said, she knew some of it. She didn't know the retirement piece. I don't think she wanted to know. That answer told me everything about my sister in that moment. She knew enough to be uncomfortable, but not enough to act. She'd insulated herself in the same way our parents had insulated themselves from the truth about how they'd treated me. Everyone in my family was an expert at looking the other way. I got up, walked to the counter, and picked up the folder. I put it in front of my dad and said, "Read this." He opened it, read both pages, and then read them again. When he looked up, his eyes were wet again, but there was something else there. Relief. He said, "You do this?" I said, "I'm not doing it for free, Dad. I need you to read the conditions." The conditions were straightforward. I would cover their remaining debts, structured as a loan with a repayment plan scaled to their income. 0 interest. No deadline pressure. In return, I wanted 3 things. First, a family conversation, all 4 of us, where the truth was spoken out loud with no deflection. Second, a written apology from my mother, because she'd been the one to say, "Adam will understand," and I needed her to acknowledge that in her own words. Third, Gemma needed to know that I knew what she'd said. Not a confrontation. I just wanted it known. My dad agreed to all 3 without hesitation. He signed the document right there at my kitchen table. Then he did something he hadn't done since I was about 12 years old. He hugged me, and for about 30 seconds, he held on like I was the only solid thing in the room. The wedding happened that day. I wasn't there. From what Landry told me later, it was beautiful. Jolene looked stunning. The barn was gorgeous. But there were cracks. My absence was noticed, and my parents gave vague answers that satisfied no one. Gemma was overheard telling someone I had a scheduling conflict, which is a creative way to describe being thrown out of your sister's life. Tully told me Jolene looked at the empty seat where I would have been and had to excuse herself for 10 minutes. The family conversation happened 2 weeks later. Jolene and Coulter drove to Nashville. We sat in my living room, the 4 of us plus Sutton. Jolene cried before anyone said anything. She said she'd let Gemma's pressure override her judgment, that she'd sacrificed the one person who never asked for anything. She said, "You were easy to cut because you never complained. And that's the worst reason in the world." My mom read her handwritten apology aloud. She said she'd spent years taking me for granted because I was reliable and because reliable people don't seem like they need attention. She said, "I forgot that being strong doesn't mean you don't hurt." That one broke me open. We talked for 3 hours. The hardest moment came when Sutton said, very calmly, "Emmett's first birthday party had a dinosaur cake and 12 people who showed up because they wanted to be there. Your grandson deserved to see his grandparents that day." My mom put her head in her hands, and I think that single sentence did more work than anything else spoken in that room. As for Gemma, my dad handled it. He told me he sat down with Coulter's parents and said, plainly, "My son knows what was said about him, and I'm not okay with it." Landry told me Gemma's reaction was something between embarrassment and indignation, but Coulter's dad apparently looked uncomfortable enough to suggest that he'd known all along it was wrong too. Coulter himself called me a few days later and apologized directly. I appreciated that. I told him we were good. That was 8 months ago. Here's where things are now. My parents are paying back the loan, slowly but consistently. They downsized some expenses, and my dad picked up part-time consulting work with a local electrical contractor. They're going to be fine. My mom calls me every Sunday now, not because I asked her to, but because she wants to. She asks about Emmett, about Sutton, about work. She's trying, and it's genuine. Jolene and I are rebuilding. It's not what it was, and it might never be. But she drove to Nashville last month for lunch, just the 2 of us, and she said, "I used to think being the favorite was a good thing. But all it really did was teach me that love was conditional and everyone else's was negotiable." That hit harder than any apology. Sullivan and I officially signed the partnership agreement. I'm co-owner of a company that just crossed $2.5 million in projected annual revenue. I hired 2 new technicians last month. Sutton and I are looking at bigger houses in Spring Hill, something with a yard where Emmett can run and where his little sister or brother can grow up. Because yeah, we're expecting again. Due in November. Deacon and Rosalind threw us a little cookout to celebrate the baby news. My parents drove down for it. My dad helped Deacon with the grill, and my mom held Emmett the entire afternoon. When they left, my dad shook my hand at the door and said, "I'm proud of you, son." I should have said it more. I told him he was right, he should have. And then I told him I'd see him next month. I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything is perfect. There are days when I think about that phone call from Waverly, and I feel the ghost of that 40-minute silence in my truck. Those scars don't disappear just because someone says sorry. But here's what I've learned. Your worth isn't determined by the people who are supposed to love you the most. Sometimes those people are the last ones to see it. And when they finally do, it's not because you begged them to look. It's because you stood tall enough that they couldn't look away. My name's Adam. I'm 34. I've got a beautiful wife, an amazing son, another one on the way, a business with my name on it, and a family that's finally learning how to show up. And if you're sitting in your car right now, staring at your steering wheel, wondering what you did wrong, hear me out. You didn't do anything wrong. You just outgrew the box they built for you. And that's not your problem to fix.